Black, proud, independent, determined, educated, resilient, compassionate, batty, funny, quirky, unique, creative, thoughtful, sincere, loyal, gutsy, vibrant, resourceful, imaginative, engaging, fabulous, awesome. Those are all words that describe me, the Brick City Brown Chick. Welcome to my podcast, What I Know Now. Thanks for listening.
It was the 3rd of September. That day I'll always remember. That was the day that my daddy died. Welcome back to What I Know Now. I am your host, the Brick City Brown Chick, and this is episode 8, Grief, the Sequel. I started with that quote from a song by The Temptations because this is the episode where I talk in detail about my father's death and how that affected me. I am hoping to get this episode recorded in one take because emotionally, I'm not sure how many times I can do this, but here we go. Papa Was a Rolling Stone, which is the Temptations song, was one of my dad's favorites. And it's also one of my favorites. It's one of those rare songs that I love that I have no direct emotional connection to. Papa Was a Rolling Stone is a song about a son trying to mourn a father that he never knew because his father was in and out of his life, off with other women, making families with other women that weren't his mother, that type of thing. That is not my experience. And it was also not my father's experience. His mother died in childbirth with his youngest sister, and he was raised by his father and his maternal grandmother. So it's not a song of direct experience, but it's one I love because it's so raw. And just as an aside, if you're a Gen Xer and you'd like to Google the song, there's a great version that was released in the 1980s by a band called Was Not Was. So please look up the original and please also look up the Was Not Was version because it was the 80s. There is a rap piece in it that makes the song even deeper and more emotionally charged. So if you're into music, please look those up. Some stories don't need to be told in chronological order, but this one does because that's the way it's going to make the most sense. My father, whose name was M, was a girl dad long before that was a term. My father took me nearly everywhere with him, including to Cub Scout meetings. He was a Cub Scout leader, and he would bring me to these meetings, and it would be me and like 15 to 20 boys. And at one point, one of the boys said, why do you always bring your daughter? Like, this is a boys' thing. And my father said, my daughter will not be excluded from any activity because she's a girl. She is my daughter. She goes with me where I go. And both of my parents felt very strongly about that. I've heard a couple of Gen X people on social media say that Gen X is the last feral generation, We were the generation who grew up without babysitters. If we got home before our parents did, we had keys. They told us to go in the house, lock the door. We could use the microwave, but don't turn on the stove. And we all followed those directions. I never felt feral because my parents literally took me with them everywhere. Excuse me. If it was somewhere that they needed to go that they couldn't take me, they would leave me with an aunt or uncle. But I really didn't grow up with babysitters. So that was my experience. My father and I were very close. We were and are very similar in personality. My father was much more of a listener than a talker. If you just met him, he wouldn't say very much. You might even think he was kind of standoffish, but he was always observing and always listening. And once you got to know him, he would talk to you more, but in the beginning, he was just very observant of people and their relationships. And I am a lot like that too. I'm not a big social butterfly. I have friends, of course, but it's not a mob scene of people. And it's never been that way. When I was in high school, I had 4 or 5 friends. When I was in college, I had 4 or 5 friends. That's kind of my social circle. And the friends have changed over the years, but the cohesiveness of the circle hasn't changed. So my father was super introspective, and I am that too. And one of the things about being introspective is you get very easily frustrated with people who are not introspective. I don't have a lot of patience with people who don't think about their actions and think about the consequences of their actions. I don't have a lot of patience with that. And my father didn't either. My father taught special education for almost 30 years. He taught grade school special education, so K through 8. And I would go to his workplace occasionally to see him, especially after I started driving. The sort of unwritten rule with my parents was whenever someone needed a new car, the car always went to my mother because she would cart me around most of the time to cheerleading and dance classes and newspaper and all those sorts of things. So my father always felt it was important that she got the new car. Also because he worked maybe 5 blocks from our house, which is where the school he taught at was, whereas my mother worked 3 towns away from where he lived. The last piece of that is my father had a 1971 Impala. And if you don't know what that car looks like, Google it because it's a boat. It was a huge car. It had bucket seats, which for people of a certain age won't mean anything. But if you're Gen X or Boomer or older, you grew up with cars like that. You know what I'm talking about. It was a burgundy car that had white leather seats. It was a very distinctive vehicle, and he loved that car. So it's not like he ever really wanted a new car because he wanted to keep that one. So that's how things rolled with my parents in terms of who got the car. When I turned 17 and became of driving age, I would take him to work sometimes or pick him up from work. And I noticed that the kids in his class would always just sort of stare at me kind of strangely. And initially I thought it was because they were special education kids and they just didn't quite understand. My father would always introduce me and say I was his daughter. So one day when I came to pick him up, one of the kids raised his hand and asked me how old my younger sister was. And I was confused because I'm an only child and I don't have any sisters. And what I finally figured out was my father kept on his desk a picture of me from when I was 5 years old, from when I first started taking dance classes. And so all the kids interpreted that as that's how old I was. And I looked at him and I said, Dad, seriously, that's the only picture you have here of me. And I'm not even smiling. I mean, I look like a little kid with the little dance pose and I looked really irritated, which I probably was. And I'm wearing the little fluffy costume and the tap shoes. And I'm like, Dad, I'm 17. That picture's like 13, 14 years old. And he looked at me and he said, I love this picture. This is the picture I keep on my desk. And I said, okay, but can you get a more current picture of me too? Can you put them side by side? And he finally agreed to do that. But it was just very funny to me that that was literally the only picture he kept in his classroom. One of my father's additional responsibilities in his school was to be the bus monitor. And to be the bus monitor, you had to make sure in the afternoon that all the kids got on their buses, but even more importantly than that, that the right kids got on the right buses. Keep in mind, this was a school of special education kids. So from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday, some of the kids wouldn't remember what their bus number was or who their bus driver was. So that was a super stressful thing for my father to have to do every afternoon, 5 days a week, is making sure all the kids got where they were supposed to. Occasionally, kids would get left behind or miss their bus, and my dad would drive them home. Now, I'm sure today that would cause all sorts of consternations with the parents, but back in the 70s, that's what happened. He would make sure the kid got home okay. So my father's job was just super stressful. He loved it, but it was stressful. And so he always had high blood pressure. That was a constant thing in his life. And he had, I don't know that there's a term for it. What I've always called it is triple digit blood pressure, because my father's blood pressure rarely went under the bottom number triple digit. So it's triple digits on the top and triple digits on the bottom. And if you know anything about blood pressure, that's not good. It's super bad for your health. Sometimes the school nurse would like see him in the hallway and he didn't look right, and she would force him to the health office and take his blood pressure, and it would be some ridiculous number, like 250 over 140, and she would just make him sit there until his blood pressure came down. So that was not an unusual circumstance. The other issue that was a constant in my father's life, especially in the winter in New Jersey where I grew up, was he had lung issues. He used to smoke cigars, like when I was super young, he and his brothers would smoke cigars, but he'd given that up years before. But I think the combination of smoking cigars and also the fact that he served 2 tours in Korea during the Korean War and was exposed to who knows what. And the combination of those two things always made his lungs sensitive to cold. So every winter, practically, as far as I can remember, my father would end up in the hospital for a few days because he'd either have pneumonia or bronchitis. Excuse me. And people in the health industry know those are both bad. But it was sort of an annual ritual. And it would usually happen pretty soon after his birthday. So we'd get through my father's birthday, Christmas, and my parents' anniversary. We might get to New Year's before Dad would have to go to the hospital. But that was an annual thing. So that was not unusual. So when my father began to get really sick, was the year I had turned 17, got my driver's license, all that kind of stuff. So it was soon after Christmas that he went into the hospital. And like I said, that was an annual ritual, so that was not unusual. And I didn't think too much about it. I'd go and see him and see how he was doing. I noticed that he was losing a few pounds, but that was also not unusual for my father either. It used to drive my mother absolutely nuts that my father could gain 10 or 15 pounds over the year since he saw his physician and get up to like 180, 185, and then he'd make his annual physical appointment and he'd be able to drop 15 pounds and he'd be back down to the same weight he was when he saw the doctor last year. And the doctor was always amazed that he never gained any weight, he never lost any weight, at least from the doctor's perspective. Lots of women would like to be able to do that. I would like to be able to do that, but that doesn't work for me. So that wasn't unusual for me either, that he lost some weight while he was in the hospital. December turned to January, and at this point, he was in the hospital for about 3 weeks, which was significantly longer than he had been in the past. But again, I did not think much of it. During that particular time, I noticed a significant change in my mother. She was frazzled, which my mother doesn't get frazzled, so that was new. She was frustrated. She was much snippier with me, like really quick to get upset with me. And I didn't know if that was the stress of working every day and then spending hours at the hospital, or I don't know. I really did not know what it was, but I just kind of tried to stay out of her way, I guess is a good thing to say. By the time we got to the end of January, she seemed like much more calm, but something she said to me repeatedly was, if you want to know what's wrong with your father, you need to talk to him. And the first couple of times she said that, I really didn't understand that that was a hint that she was trying to tell me something without telling me something. And so it didn't really click for me. And I was a teenage girl. I freely admit that I was self-absorbed and in my own world. I was a high school senior. There was all this stuff to look forward to, like prom and graduation and all this stuff that went on. And so I was not really thinking about the external situation. By that point, my father had been in the hospital over a month, and that was super unusual. That had never happened before. But I really did not connect A to B because, again, I was in my own space. So I guess end of January, beginning of February, I was at the hospital one day, and I was sitting with my father, and he said, "Did your mother talk to you?" And I said, "About what?" And he said, "About me." And in that moment, looking at him and looking at the expression on his face, I knew what he was telling me. I didn't know what or why or any of that, but I understood. And that's the extent of what he said. He never said, "I have cancer." And he certainly never said, "I'm going to die." Those are two things he never said. Excuse me. So, because I was so introspective, I think, I got it in that moment. And I did not have long to get it because he died 2 weeks later. Interestingly enough, the day I am taping this, not the day it will be released, but the day I am taping this is exactly 36 years to the day that he died. The night before he died, my mother was at the hospital for hours because she would do that. Over the time he'd been in the hospital, the nurses had taken a liking to her because she was there every day. They knew she was working. She was a school teacher. She was working sort of 8 to 4, and then she'd come home and check on me and make sure I was good and then go to the hospital. So they knew she was wrestling with a teenager and work. And so they would always let her stay past visiting hours. Visiting hours ended at 8 o'clock back then. And the hospital my father was in was literally half a block from where we lived. It doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down several years ago. But ironically, that is also the hospital I was born in. So the hospital I was born in is the hospital my dad died in. So the night before he died, she had been at the hospital until midnight, which was pretty routine. And she came home, she checked on me, made sure I ate, made sure I did my homework, all those sorts of things. And I went to bed, she went to bed. And I heard the phone ring, and it must have been like, I don't know, 2:45, 3 o'clock in the morning. And I immediately sat up because I knew what that phone call was. And my mother answered the phone, and I did not hear the conversation. All I heard was a guttural scream, the likes of which I've never heard before or since. It was just the most anguished, painful thing I have ever heard in my life. And after she got off the phone, she took a couple of minutes to pull herself back together. And then she walked down the hall into my room and said, "Your father's gone. I have to go to the hospital and identify him. I'll be back." And she left. And that left me with my thoughts and my feelings. And I remember in that immediate aftermath was the beginning of the anger. Not just, I think people go through this angry at God phase. But more than that, I was angry with my father, obviously, because he hadn't told us. And that was a really emotionally devastating place to be in. But by the time my mother came back from the hospital, must have been, 4 a.m., I had to be up at 6 a.m. to go to school if I was going to go to school. But as I said, by this point I was driving. I had my own car, and I had been through enough deaths of close family members to know that day, the day he died, was going to be chaos. Because my mother would have to make all the phone calls, and people would be coming by the house, and it would just be bedlam. And I could not deal with it. I was not prepared to deal with the insanity. I really wasn't. And my senior year of high school, I was president of the student council, which sounds like neither here nor there, but it's relevant to the story. And we had some big, I don't even remember, pep rally or something. I don't know. Something going on that day that I was supposed to moderate as the president of the student council. And I never did go back to sleep that night. I got up at 6 a.m. and was like, yeah, I got to go to school. I cannot be here emotionally, but also I have things to do. And so I got up, I took a shower, I got dressed, all that. And I came downstairs like after 7 o'clock, had breakfast, picked up my car keys and my books, and yelled to my mother I was going to school because she was upstairs. And she came downstairs, running down the stairs, and she's like, "Where are you going?" It's like, "I'm going to school." It's like, "I'm wearing my uniform. I'm going to school." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "I cannot be here. Cannot be here for this. I can't deal." So I'm going to school and do what I need to do in my, 17-year-old life. So I went to school. Unbeknownst to me, she called the principal of the school, Sister Anne, before I got there and was like, heads up, this is what happened, and she's on her way. And so the principal, who was just not the most friendly of women, but I mean, intense, serious, none. Just not the most friendly, touchy-feely kind of person. She met me at the door of the school and said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Because I can't be home. I need to focus on what I need to focus on. My mother's gonna handle all this. Her sisters, her sister-in-laws, like they'll all be there. They'll help her. I can't do this." And she just sort of stepped out of my way and let me into the building. And I was not talkative to people before the bell rang for homeroom or any of that. I was usually pretty chatty in the morning, but I just didn't have it in me. And so I went to homeroom. And one of my best friends in high school was a girl named Jay. And we had the same last name. Now, understand that Jay and I looked nothing alike at all, except we were both black. I am 5'3". Jay was like 5'8", dark skinned. Think Lupita Nyong'o. Beautiful, long, thick hair. My hair's never been any longer than this, my natural hair, because her grandmother was Cherokee. I mean, she was just model thin, just beautiful. But somehow, our high school had a nasty habit of confusing us. Not in person. In person, it was super easy. But in our student files, they would inevitably call her to the office and ask her about something related to student council or something else I was involved in. And she was like, "No, you want the other one." Or they'd call me to the office about my mother calling that she was going to be late. And I'm like, "No, that's not my mother. You want the other one." So that was a common thing that we both gotten used to, even as seniors. That still went on. So I was sitting in homeroom and I heard that we had these daily PA announcements about things that were going on in the school and fundraisers and yada, yada, yada. So that particular morning, I heard the principal, who never did announcements, get on the PA system and say, "We would like to pray for the soul of our student council president's father, M, who passed away this morning." Or at least that's what I thought she said. What she actually said was, "We want to pray for the soul of our student council president, J, whose father died this morning." And not only did they use my friend's name, they also used her father's name. And I had no idea what her father's name was. So my immediate reaction out loud in a room full of people, including our homeroom teacher, who was a nun, was, "Who the hell is blank?" And my friend turned around and said, "They confused our files again. That's my father. He died when I was 5." And I busted out laughing because I just could not believe that even on this day, they still got it wrong. And I just laughed. And everybody was looking at me except my friend, like, "I think she's snapped. Like, I think this has just taken her out." And it was just one of the few humorous moments over those days in the immediate aftermath that stuck with me. It was just ridiculous. So by the time I got home, of course, the house was full of people. My mother had called everybody. It was all in motion. And she said to me, I need you to come with me to the funeral home to pick out, your father's casket and all this other stuff. And I just thought, oh God, I can't do this. I really can't do this. But I did because she asked. And my mother rarely asks anything of me, especially something that serious. So I went with her and we went through all the choices, and then it turned into, what are we going to bury him in? I had no answer for that. And quietly but out loud, she said, we're going to bury him in his white suit. And we, you and I, are going to wear white to this funeral. We are going to be united as a family. And my first thought was, where in the world are we going to find white dress? It's February. But somehow or other, that all came into being. She and I wore the exact same dress, different sizes, but it was the same dress. And my father's wake was super hard. The funeral was super hard. Although the day of his funeral was another one of those instances over the course of these many days that I just had to laugh and take myself out of the situation. My mother's doctor had given her, I don't honestly know, it was the 80s. Let's say it was Xanax. I think Xanax was legal then. He gave her Xanax to help her sleep and to help her cope. She decided she didn't need that for sleeping, but that the immediate family who was going to the funeral, who was riding in the family cars, needed the Xanax for the service. So she literally lined us all up in the house and made us all take a Xanax and gave us a Dixie cup, which were disposable cups of water, to make sure we were all calm. Because what she kept saying is she didn't want anybody showing out at the funeral. Now, I'm sure Black people understand exactly what I mean by that. But if you're not Black, or that's just a term you're not familiar with, sometimes at funerals, people just fall out, pass out, scream, cry. It's just the emotional nature of the situation. And my mother is a person who does not like scenes. She does not like drama. So she wanted to make sure we were all good. Nobody was going to do that at the funeral. Well, my father's aunt, she was my great aunt, Elle, he was her favorite nephew. And his death was incredibly devastating to her and for her. And she was not at the house before the service. So when we went to the cemetery for the burial service, she showed out. She had a complete and total meltdown and tried to throw herself into the grave. Now, there are two things to understand about this. My great aunt was at the time a woman in her mid 70s. And she was also not a small woman. She was probably close to 300 pounds. So we were all in a state of just panic because we all knew if she went into that grave, we would have to call 911 because there's no way we'd be able to get her out. So it took two of her nephews to sort of drag her back from the edge and get her away from the coffin because she was so devastated. And in that moment, my mother leaned over and said, "This is what I wanted to avoid." So it was just kind of one of those moments of just absolute ridiculousness in that particular moment of grief and sorrow. After my father's death, and I mean within like a week, my mother decided that she just could not live with his things. any of his things. And so she gave away all his clothes and all of his personal items. She just needed them out of the house. And the last thing was his recliner, was his easy chair. And so that was the last thing. She like dragged out to the curb by herself, would not let anybody help her. She was just in a state of just complete and total devastation. And she and I were in different places. Like I said last episode, grief is the only emotion that we all have to go through alone. So even though we lived in the same house and we were grieving the same person, our grief was very different. She was grieving her husband of 27 years. I was grieving my father of 17 years. And it was just a very different grief. And we did not talk to each other about our grief at all. That is not something we did until many years later. And by many years, I mean like 25 years. It wasn't that long ago that she and I sat down and talked about how each of us felt. What I know now at 53 that I didn't know at 17 is that when someone dies, the farther away you get from it, it's not so much that it hurts less, in that the pain is different. I am very emotional right now, but I'm not nearly as emotional as I was in the couple of years after it happened, or in my 20s, or in my 30s. That doesn't mean the pain's less. It just means I've learned to cope with it better. The other thing I know now that I did not know then is everyone chooses to do what's right for them at that point in time. My mother struggled, for many years after my father's death, emotionally, in terms of she wanted to understand the why. She wanted to know why this man she was married to for half her life did not tell her that he was going to die. And that's something I struggled with for years too. But again, because we weren't talking to each other about it, we were handling it differently. And about probably close to 10 years ago now, I went to see a medium. And if you don't know what a medium is, people think fortune teller. It's not what a medium is. A medium is a person who, if you believe in them, has the ability to communicate with the spirit world, has the ability to feel spirits of people and talk to people and that sort of thing. So I went to see a medium that came recommended by someone else who went for a similar reason. And all she asked me was my name. And then she started talking about, different people I had lost. And she would never say, this is your father, or this is your grandmother, or whatever. But she would describe the person to me. And I would make assumptions about who the person was. And so when she got to my father, I knew very clearly that it was him. And so what I said to her was, what I wanted to know and understand is, I said, I asked her if she could ask him, did he understand that, at the time, as a woman in my 40s, that I was no longer angry with him, that I let go of the anger I had from his choosing not to share his diagnosis. And after a few minutes, what she said to me is, she said, he says he understands, but his question to you is, what difference would it have made? And I taped this conversation with her, which she was fine with. But when I went back and listened to it, like my immediate thought was, what is that? Like, that just sounds like a flippant response. Like, are you kidding me? Like, I was super annoyed. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that the meaning was my knowing or my mother's knowing would not have changed the outcome. He had cancer of the esophagus, which, if you don't know, your esophagus is here. It plays a part in your breathing. Sometimes when people swallow incorrectly, it goes down the esophagus and causes all kinds of issues. At the time he was diagnosed and he died, the cure rate, if you went through chemo and radiation and a whole lot of other horrible treatments, was about 15%. He knew that. He understood that. So from his perspective, it was, you'll mourn me if you know, and you'll mourn me if you don't know. So what difference did my not telling you make? Now, even saying that out loud now, years later, it still feels very like, what? But understanding who my father was and how practical he was and how introspective he was, I have a better understanding of what that means. This episode has gone on longer than I anticipated, but at least I was able to get through it in the first take. The big thing I have to share that I want people to take away from this is you never let go of the loss. When I said, when I said last episode, time heals all wounds is a myth and closure is a lie, I still feel that way. I still mean that. It never, your love for that person never goes away, and your pain from their loss also never goes away. You learn to cope, you learn to deal because you're the living, you're the person still here. So you do have to learn to move forward from that. People ask me all the time if my father's death has made me stronger. And I heard a statement years ago that is just the perfect response. And that is, I am not the person I was meant to be. I am the person that circumstances have made me be. And what that means for me is, would I be the person I am had my father lived? Probably not. I would probably be different in some very key ways. But I can't tell you what those are because it's not the reality of my circumstance. He did die when I was 17, and I did have to adjust and change based on his death. And so I want everybody to, hug their loved ones tighter and tell them that you love them, and know that it can get better. You will get better. Things will get better. But it'll never be the way it was. And that's just how life is. I want to thank everybody for joining me this week, especially if you're new to the podcast. If you, I won't say enjoyed this episode, but you got some learning and some healing from it, I ask you to pass on the website address. You can pick up this podcast wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify. And if you don't have any of those services and you want to see me be emotional in addition to hear it, you can catch this on my YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and type in Brick City Brown Chick, I will pop up, as will this podcast. So thank everybody for joining me this week, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.